咁就好多謝阿貴標嘅邀請啦，咁咧就即係讓我有機會可以同大家去即係分享一下，即係我自己嘅一啲即係研究嘅心得啦。咁就咁呢個 phenomenal conservatism 咧就其實唔係形而上學嘅理論嚟嘅，佢係知識論裏邊嘅理論嚟嘅嚇，佢係而家當今西方嘅即係知識論裏邊一個好重要嘅一個理論。咁咧就咁由於我睇嘅資料全部都英文啦，咁咧我寫嘅 PowerPoint 都係用英文啦，咁咧就我諗為咗嗰個即係我做報告嘅過程裏邊比較順暢，即係唔需要我下下子去做翻譯啦，咁咧我就打算咧仲用英文嚟到去做報告。OK， 咁咧就咁但係我哋討論嘅時候咧，就係可以用翻中文嘅。咁我相信呢個安排可能會係最順暢嘅嚇。好，咁我就開始啦嚇。咁即係我相信貴標已經將呢個 PowerPoint send 咗俾大家啦。咁即係其實大家都可以即係可以睇到，即係除咗喺呢個視像會議裏邊，你都可以自己手頭有份 PowerPoint，你就可以翻前翻後去睇嘅嚇。好嗱咁我用英文去做 presentation 啊。OK，
係，或者停一停先嚇，即係嗱，即係各位朋友，我講一聲啦。咁如果你係即係想陳博士佢講嘅時候咧，你睇翻佢用咩字眼？有啲係如果 PowerPoint 你就睇翻 PowerPoint 啦嚇。咁但係佢其他嘅字眼咧，其實喺 Google Meet 咧有一個掣咧，就係 turn on 或者 turn off captions。嗰個咧就係將啲聲音咧即時轉做英文嘅，好似 YouTube 啊嗰啲影片咁樣啊。咁你有需要咧可以撳下呢個掣，係最下低係右邊嘅啊。咁大家可以留意下。咁如果有需要，你按呢個掣咁樣。係 OK， 可以繼續下。
好，咁我開始啦。Now, in this talk, I shall address the following questions. Okay, so there are 5 questions I'm going to address in this course. Okay, the first question, what is phenomenal conservatism? The second, what are the arguments for phenomenal conservatism? The third, what are the arguments against phenomenal conservatism? The fourth, is phenomenal conservatism initially plausible? The fifth one, what are the implications or what are the bearings of phenomenal conservatism on other issues of philosophy? So these are the questions I'm going to address in this talk. So let's start with the first question. What is phenomenal conservatism? Now, phenomenal conservatism is one of the most important theories of knowledge today. Okay, it is a theory in epistemology today. It is an internalist theory of epistemic justification. It tells us when a proposition or belief would obtain epistemic justification and when it would be epistemically justified. The name phenomenal conservatism first appeared in Michael Hume's book, Skepticism and the Veil of Perception. However, even before Hume's book, some versions of phenomenal conservatism were already advocated by Prior, Roderick Chisholm, and Richard Swinburne. Some of the most important defenders of phenomenal conservatism today are Michael Hume, Chris Tucker, Luca Moretti, and Richard Swinburne. Okay, now phenomenal conservatism, let us use PC as its abbreviation, is the following doctrine. Okay, if it seems to us that P, okay, if it seems to us that a proposition P is true, then in the absence of defeaters, S, the subject S, okay, the person S, thereby has at least some justification for believing that P. Okay, so let me repeat. Okay, so this is the doctrine of PC. If it seems to a subject, to a person S, that a certain proposition P, okay, is true, then in the absence of defeaters, that is, in the absence of contrary evidence, S thereby has at least some justification for believing that P. Now, what is meant by defeaters? Now, defeaters can be divided into two sorts. Okay, rebutting defeaters and undercutting defeaters. Now, suppose that a proposition P, for example, there is a cup on the table, is directly grounded on experience E. For example, the visual experience of seeing a cup on the table. Now, a rebutting defeater for P is a piece of evidence showing that experience E is illusory. That is, E is not veridical. For example, when we try to grasp the cup with our hands, we can touch air only. Okay. In this circumstance, we shall have evidence. Okay. We shall have evidence that proposition P is false. Okay, that our experience is just an illusion. So this kind of contrary evidence is called rebutting defeater, okay, for proposition P. Now, another sort of defeater is called undercutting defeater. Now, an undercutting defeater for P is a piece of evidence showing that E is unreliable as a source of information. Okay, for example, one has just consumed marijuana. The fact that one has consumed marijuana, the drug, would not necessarily make his experience to be illusory, but it would make his experience unreliable as a source of information. So this is what the term defeaters mean. So there are two different kinds of defeaters: rebutting defeaters and undercutting defeaters. Rebutting defeaters is evidence which can show that P is false. Okay. However, undercutting defeater is evidence that shows that the ground for P is weak. Okay, that is, the experience on which P is built is unreliable. So this is undercutting defeater. Now the
OK， 睇得停聲啊，唔好意思嚇，陳博士，係可唔可以開 full screen？ 因為睇得比較辛苦，啲字好似細啲咁樣。咁你可以撳你個 PowerPoint 右下邊啊。
OK，
係 OK， 清楚嚇。
Okay, the word seeming here means experiences with propositional content and a particular phenomenal character. That is the view of a mental state whose content reveals how things really are. So sensory experiences, memories, introspective states, moral experiences, and religious experiences count as seemings. But hoping and imagining are not seemings. For example, I have the visual experience that a computer is on the table. The proposition, a computer is on the table, is the propositional content of my visual experience. The visual experience reveals to me that there is a computer on the table, so my visual experience is a seeming. Now, according to PC, since my visual experience tells me that there is a computer on the table, and since there is no evidence showing that my visual experience is unreliable or illusory, I am epistemically justified, at least to some extent, for thinking that there is a computer on the table. Now, phenomenal conservatives do not hold that appearances are an infallible source of information, or even that they are guaranteed to be generally reliable. Phenomenal conservatives simply hold that to assume things are the way they appear is a rational default position, which one should maintain unless and until grounds for doubt, that is, defeaters, appear. The intuitive idea is that it makes sense to assume that things are the way they seem unless and until one has reasons for doubting this. So we have already looked at the doctrine of phenomenal conservatism, but is it true? Why should we believe that it is true? So let's turn to the arguments for phenomenal conservatism. Now, there are 7 arguments for phenomenal conservatism. The first argument is the argument from epistemic rationality, and then the argument from internalism, and then the self-defeat argument, and then the argument that PC is able to avoid skepticism and provide a unified way to address different forms of skepticism. And the argument from simplicity, that is, PC provides a unified and simple account of non-inferential justification. The sixth argument is that PC coheres well with our paradigmatic epistemic practices. And the last one is the bet to resist belief argument. So let's start with the first argument, the argument from epistemic rationality. Now, this argument is put forward by Michael Huemer. Let's look at the argument, and the argument has 2 premises. Okay, now let's start with premise 1. Now, premise 1 is an assumption. Okay, so let us assume, okay, that it seems to a subject S, it seems to a person S, that proposition P is true, and S has no reason to doubt P. Okay, so let's let this be the assumption. Okay, and then we have premise 2. It is epistemically rational for subject S to do X if doing X would appear from S standpoint to be an effective way of satisfying the central epistemic goal of believing the true and not believing the false. Okay, now from premises 1 and 2, we can derive statement 3. Therefore, from S standpoint, believing P, okay, would appear to be an effective means of pursuing the central epistemic goal. Okay, so statement 3 is derivable from premise 1. Okay, and then from premises 2 and 3, we can derive statement 4. Therefore, S believing P would be epistemically rational. Okay, S believing P would be epistemically rational, and so epistemically justified. Okay, and then since from assumption 1, okay, from assumption 1, we can derive statement 4. Therefore, we can come to the conclusion, that is statement 5. If it seems to S that P is true and S has no reason to doubt P, then S believing P would be epistemically justified. So that is the argument from epistemic rationality. And then we have the argument from internalism. Okay, now in epistemology, there are 2 theories about the justification of a belief, that is internalism and externalism. Now, internalism is the doctrine that the justification or lack of justification of a belief is entirely a function of the internal mental states or factors internal to the mind of the subject. Externalism, on the other hand, is the doctrine that the justification or lack of justification of a belief depends on some external factors. For example, reliabilism is an externalist theory of justification. Now, here is Huemer's argument from internalism. Okay, premise 1. Either internalism is true or externalism is true. Premise 2. Internalism is rationally preferable to externalism. And premise 3. Phenomenal conservatism is the rationally preferred form of internalism. And from these 3 premises, it immediately follows that phenomenal conservatism is true. So I think that the argument is a logically correct argument. That means the conclusion follows from the premises. So the crucial question is, why should we believe that the premises are true? Now, premise 1, I think, is not problematic at all. It seems to be a truism, okay, even a tautology, okay. So the crucial question lies on premise 2 and premise 3, whether these two premises are true. So let's turn to premise 2 and see what are the reasons behind premise 2. Now, here is an argument for premise 2. Okay, now let's start with 2.1. Okay, 2.1, externalism is true. Now, again, this is an assumption. Okay. Now, from 2.1, we can derive statement 2.2. Therefore, there is some external factor E on which the justification of a belief depends. Okay. And then from 2.2, we can derive 2.3. The following scenario is logically possible. There are two propositions P and Q, which appear to be exactly alike in all epistemically relevant respects. For example, they are equally supported by our experience. They are equally simple. Okay, they have equal predictive power, etc. However, P but not Q possesses E. Okay. And from 2.3, we can derive 2.4. Therefore, it is possible that a person who says to himself sincerely, P and Q seem to be equally correct, equally justified, and in every other respect equally worthy of belief. Nevertheless, I believe P and refuse to believe Q for no apparent reason. Okay, is adopting a rational set of attitudes towards P and Q. Okay, and now since from the assumption 2.1, we can derive statement 2.4. Therefore, we can derive 2.5. That is, if 2.1 is true, then 2.4 would be true. So we have arrived at 2.5. If externalism is true, then 2.4 is true. Okay. However, 2.6, statement 2.4 is obviously false. Okay. Now, from 2.5 and 2.6, we can immediately derive that externalism is false. So this is an argument supporting premise 2. So we have already given a justification for premise 2, and then let's move to premise 3. Now, why should we think that premise 3 is true? Now, here is a reason. Now, as the above argument indicates, it is impossible for P and Q to seem the same to one in all relevant epistemic respects, and yet for P to be justified and Q unjustified. Now, phenomenal conservatism provides the best explanation for the above fact. Therefore, phenomenal conservatism is the rationally preferred version of internalism. So here we have already provided justification for 3 as well. So since the first 3 premises justify, and since the conclusion follows from the premises, therefore we have good reasons for thinking that the conclusion is true. Therefore, phenomenal conservatism is true. Then we come to the bet to resist belief argument. Okay, the bet to resist belief argument. Now here is the argument. This argument is put forward by Chris Tucker. Okay, the argument has 3 premises and 1 conclusion. Premise 1: if you seem to see that P, in the absence of other relevant considerations, that is, in the absence of contrary evidence, then your experience makes it unreasonable to disbelieve that P. Okay, or believe any proposition incompatible with P. That is premise 1. And then premise 2: if you seem to see that P, in the absence of other relevant considerations, your experience makes it unreasonable to withhold judgment about P. And then premise 3: if you seem to see that P, in the absence of other relevant consideration, that is, in the absence of contrary evidence, your experience makes it reasonable to believe that P, or disbelieve that P, or withhold judgment about P. Okay. Now, from the three premises, we can derive the conclusion. Therefore, if you seem to see that P in the absence of other relevant considerations, then your experience makes it reasonable to believe that P. Now, let us. Now, this argument is a deductively correct argument. That is, it is a valid argument. So, if the premises are all true, then the conclusion must be true. But why should we believe that the premises are true? So, let's start with premise 1. Now, premise 1 is obviously true. Okay, that is, if our experience tells us that P is true, okay, that P is a fact, okay, and we have no defeaters, we have no contrary evidence for P, okay, in such a circumstance, of course, it would be unreasonable for us to believe that P is false, right? So, premise 1 is obviously true. Now, how about premise 2? Let us look at premise 2 again. Now, premise 2 says, if you seem to see that P, in the absence of contrary evidence, your experience makes it unreasonable to withhold judgment about P. Okay, so if your experience tells you that P is true, okay, that P is the fact, and you have no contrary evidence against P, then your experience, that in such a circumstance, it would be unreasonable for you to suspend judgment, okay, not to make any judgment whether P is true or not. Why? Now, now here is a reason for premise 2. Now, this reason comes from Chris Tucker. Now, suppose my laptop is lying broken on the floor. I wonder what caused my laptop to break. Okay, the only relevant information I have is that the laptop was sitting firmly on the counter. The laptop is covered with the same sticky glue that is all over my 5-year-old fingers, and there are no other people or pets in the house. Now, in such a circumstance, to withhold judgment, to suspend judgment about whether my 5-year-old broke the computer seems ridiculous. Now, similarly, if you seem to clearly see, okay, if your experience tells you clearly that some specific thing is in front of you, for example, a watch is in front of me, my experience tells me clearly that a watch is now in front of me. Now, it seems at least as ridiculous to withhold judgment, to suspend judgment about whether the watch is really there. Okay, so that's the reason for premise 2. And then we have premise 3. Now, premise 3 says that if your experience tells you that P is true, and you have no contrary evidence against P, now your experience makes it either it's reasonable to believe P, okay, or it's reasonable to disbelieve P, or it's reasonable to withhold judgment about P. Okay, now I think premise 3 is quite reasonable too. Now, why? Now, my reason is this. If it is not reasonable for us to believe P, and if it is also not reasonable for us to disbelieve P, okay, then it would be reasonable for us to suspend judgment about P. Okay, so it is the case that either it is reasonable to believe P, or it is reasonable to believe to disbelieve P. Okay, that is to believe not P. Okay, or it is reasonable to suspend judgment about P. Okay, so this is a reason for premise 3. Now, since this argument is a very deductive argument, and since the premises are all justify. Okay, we have good reasons for believing that they are all true. So we have good reasons for believing that the conclusion is true. Okay. And then another argument for PC, the argument for simplicity. So here is the argument. Now, Hume said, if we accept phenomenal conservatism, now we have a single, simple principle to account for the justification of multiple, very different kinds of belief, including perceptual beliefs, moral beliefs, mathematical beliefs, memory beliefs, beliefs about one's own mind, beliefs about other minds, and so on. To the extent that simplicity and unity are theoretical virtues, then we have grounds for embracing PC. There is probably no other plausible theory that can account for so many justified beliefs in anything like such a simple manner. Okay, so the consideration of simplicity supports the truth of PC. And then we have the argument from PC's ability to avoid skepticism. Okay, now this is an argument from Hume and Moretta. PC provides a way to rebut the skeptical arguments and avoid skepticism. Now the skeptical arguments for external world skepticism, memory skepticism, and other mind skepticism assume that a subject must have independent justification for ruling out relevant skeptical alternatives or the skeptical scenarios in order to possess justification for believing ordinary things. However, why should we agree with the skeptic? Why should we accept his assumption? How does the skeptic know that his assumption is true? Okay, that is, he assumes that a subject, okay, must have independent justification for ruling out relevant skeptical scenarios in order to possess justification for believing ordinary things. Okay, but is this assumption true? Why should we accept this assumption? Why should we believe that it is true? Now, if PC is true, then that assumption would be false. If PC is true, then a subject has prima facie justification for believing a proposition. For example, there is a hen, even if the subject has no independent reason to rule out all skeptical scenarios. If a major premise in these skeptical arguments is unjustified, these skeptical arguments would not be compelling. Okay. So phenomenal conservatives point out an unjustified assumption in skeptical arguments. Okay. Now, since there is a major premise in the skeptical arguments which is not justified, the skeptical arguments are not compelling. Okay. So our question is, why should we agree with the skeptic that his assumption is true rather than PC is true? Okay, I can find no reason for preferring the skeptic's assumption to PC. So this is a way to rebut the skeptical arguments. And PC also provides a way to avoid skepticism. Now, external world skepticism is addressed by noting that, okay, according to PC, external world skepticism is addressed by noting that when we have perceptual experiences, there seem to us to be external objects of various sorts around us. In the absence of defeaters, this is good reason to think there are in fact such objects. Similar observations apply to most, if not all, forms of skepticism. Thus, the ability to avoid skepticism is among the great theoretical advantages of phenomenal conservatism.